Hello, I'm Dave Feinlieb, and this is Beyond the Shelf. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind e-commerce. Through conversations with innovators in the space, we learn the stories of these leaders and their strategies for e-commerce success. You can join our mailing list and learn more about our content creation solutions at itsrapid.ai. My guest on today's show is Doug Straton. Doug is Chief Customer Evangelist at Bazaarvoice, where he provides expert advice and insight across the business to ensure customers are getting the most value out of Bazaarvoice. He consults with leading brands and retailers where he acts as a thought leadership partner, and he helps Bazaarvoice develop new services, positioning them in the market and driving differentiated value. Before joining Bazaarvoice, Doug served as Chief Digital Officer of the Hershey Company, and prior to that, held multiple roles at Unilever, including VP of Digital, E-commerce, Omnichannel, and Data, as well as Head of Global E-commerce Strategy and Innovation. We discussed Doug's background as an executive in digital and e-commerce, the content supply chain, and where things are headed when it comes to digital and user-generated content. Please enjoy my conversation with Doug Straton. Doug, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing great. It was great seeing you at Grocery Shop. Any big takeaways from the show?
COVID was one of my big takeaways from the show, but we've since recovered. But overall, I thought it was a successful show. I think the biggest takeaway is, as you would expect, everybody's talking about AI and everybody's talking about retail media networks. I think the most interesting thing from me was just the realization after talking to dozens of clients is, food and beverage, though it's made huge strides over the last 5 years as retailers have invested in the fulfillment capabilities and micro fulfillment capabilities in some cases, is that it's still, from a digital marketing and digital commerce perspective, still catching up on the fundamentals. So things where best practice has been, pretty well established, though things do move and change and get refined and optimized over time. But still a lot of chatter about things that I would hope at this point were well understood. But it's still, the fundamentals and getting the shelf right, which is related to content, was still probably the thing that I heard the most out of all the conversations that I had.
So great. And I want to, well, first of all, I'm glad you're on the mend. So great to be here with you
Yeah.
today. That's job one, of course. And two, I definitely want to come back around to what some of those fundamentals are. But first, take us back, if you would. How did you get your start in this space?
Well, in the space, I guess the origin story would be, I helped build and run a hair care company in the 2000s, which we then ultimately sold to Unilever in 2009. It was a company called PG Hair Care, out of Dallas, Texas. And it was famous for a brand called Bedhead. And so I really ran kind of like most of the back end functions, or had a hand in it at least, because it was very much an atypical organization. And then I was essentially the GM of the international businesses, which included our distribution businesses in Latin America as well as Asia, and then a bunch of partnership companies in Europe, so UK, Ireland, Italy, Germany, and also not in Europe, but in APAC, Australia. So had a lot of global experience, and but it was true startup. It was kind of like, figure it out as we went. It was a very small company when we started. When we started, it was a relatively large company when we sold it to Unilever in 2009. And so, I just learned, just a lot about how to be scrappy. And so I had the traditional background from big companies like L'Oreal and Bristol Myers Squibb prior to going into TG, which was privately owned. But then going back into a big CPG, I was looking to differentiate myself. And there was a number of kind of consulting projects that were unfunded. And they're like, okay, we've got this executive. We want to do something with him after we've now integrated TG. What's he going to do? And they gave me 7 things to look at. 2 of them were digital. And I said, well, this is where things are going to go. And it seemed more entrepreneurial than going to run like the skincare brands or something like that. something that I could have done, but I didn't think was really me because I was so used to at that point being very startup-y and fast growth that I figured that was kind of maybe where my skill sets were, and digital was completely untapped. And so I wrote a white paper, and that turned into my global head of strategy and innovation role. And that was a very short tenure. They accepted all those recommendations, and then they said, "Well, you've got this startup background. Can you build a business in North America?" And that's what I did. So I really started with just a couple lucky bounces, and then a couple lucky picks. Yeah, it's been really fun. I'm naturally interested in technology anyway, so for me, it was a great way to dabble in something I was already interested in as well.
This ability to kind of see what's coming, if we rewind 10 years, we'd be in these conversations where ecom was 1% and digital looked interesting, but keep an eye on it. But you obviously had the foresight to say, this is where it's headed.
Yeah.
What gave you the confidence or the ability to do that and say, yeah, this is where I want to make some bets?
Well, I don't think I'm, preternaturally gifted in this area. To me, it just seemed kind of obvious. And what was lucky for me is that because I'd gotten away from big company and kind of big category thinking in the CPG space and done it kind of at a micro level and very different routes to market. um, I was actually a bit naive as to what was going on, and being a little bit naive coming back into big giant companies that were essentially selling to big giant retailers was, I just expected that they had already done a lot of the things that to me I was just expecting because I was interacting with brands that were digitally forward or whatever. So I don't think it was necessarily foresight. It was just like kind of studying where things were going and not necessarily have a preconceived notion as to what was right and wrong because I'd actually been out of the big mass environment for so long. So for me, I think it was just easy to accept that, not accept status quo because for me, there was no status quo. And so it was all about building the story and the belief around this is where things were going to go ultimately over time. And then I got a couple lucky bounces that I was able to ascertain. For example, like in food and beverage, I advised the company, even though they were actually pushing me really hard to accelerate e-commerce in those spaces. I'm like, there is no fulfillment capability at scale. There's a few regional players like the Peapods and the Fresh Directs and a little bit of Amazon Fresh at the time, but I'm like, until the big guys really lean in and put in the infrastructure, we shouldn't be investing to a large degree beyond basic things in those spaces. And so it's, couple like reading where things were going, but also reading like the reality of where our some of our channels were and where our categories were playing within those channels. That gave me a lot of credibility as like, oh, he doesn't waste money. He's being very thoughtful. He's not just pushing because that's where the growth is. And I always made a point of growing faster than the category growth rate, and always improving margins, which were the two big things. So a lot of people were just following the growth, and that was it. Um, I tried to I tried to be I tried to balance it because I come from a general management background.
I love it. So you talked earlier about the fundamentals that you were hearing and thinking about at grocery shop. We think we maybe know what those are, but what are they for you? What are you hearing those fundamentals are that maybe we shouldn't be making assumptions about?
Well, I think one of them is and again, it's part of the reason I got into a space that's the content space is that the role that content plays is so incredibly important. It's the one thing that every couple of years, you see somebody publish an article on like content is king, and it's like, well, it's always been king, and content and creative. I kind of lump those things together. It's always been king. It's more king now because number one, you've got ubiquitous access by consumers to anything they want, which needs content of some sort. And then that's one consumer of content, and then the other consumer of content is algorithms. And if you can kind of square that and kind of think through, like, the impact your content is having on first search and the ability for people to find your brand, and then second, once they've found your brand, that same content acts as an engagement tool. Those are really powerful concepts, and so many people kind of they're like, oh, I got to do this with the digital page and I have to do this, and they start to decouple, but things, and they get really really tactical very quickly. But fundamentally, there's two consumers of content, consumers and algorithms, and both of them are super super hungry. and you need to feed that in some way, shape, or form. Now, you don't want to feed it to the point where you go bankrupt, but you do need to feed those things, and you need to understand the dynamics there, and then prioritize your efforts around those dynamics.
Now, today you're chief customer officer at Bazaarvoice. You made this leap from the brand to the tech providers, and tell me about your day to day. What does it look like?
Well, it's super interesting. So I fancy myself kind of an autodidact. I wasn't a digital expert per se when I started to do all my work 12 years ago, but I quickly became one because I talked to a lot of smart people that had more experience than me, and I read a lot, and then I thought a lot. I had a lot of thinking time, to kind of to sort out my own kind of personal opinions on things, and that's been incredible for me. I mean, I really, and I had a lot of support. So it sounds like I did everything by myself at Unilever or Hershey. That is not the case. I had tons of managerial support, and I hired really incredible teams, and they all taught me. A lot of them on a tactical level are far superior than I would ever be. But I was just good at stitching things together in a really good way and tying things to corporate goals and then executing on it. Going through that experience, and in particularly going through Hershey, where we did broader transformational work, there was just I could have gone and done that again, or I could have become kind of like a CMO or CEO at like a digitally native CPG, and I did look at opportunities like that. But to me, it was still a lot of, I think, doing things that I'd already done before. And I've always kind of prided myself on, trying something new. And the reason I need to do that, I get bored very quickly. So if I'm not a little bit overwhelmed, and if I feel a little bit insecure about something, I actually do a better job. And I didn't want to get into just another job where it was like, okay, it's 3 years of me repeating myself.
You know the playbook, and
Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah,
at Hershey, I could do that a little bit because I challenged myself. Can I do what I did at Unilever, but twice as fast for half the money?
I love it.
That was like my challenge. It wasn't so much a lot of the plays. It was like, can I learn from all the mistakes I made with somebody else's money and apply them at Hershey? And but I didn't really have kind of, I couldn't figure out what that internal challenge would be. So I said, okay, well, where am I weak? Or where do I perceive myself to be weak? And what do I not know? And what could be really interesting? And again, I'm interested in technology in general. So I said, okay, I'm going to go for private equity, growth equity firms that are building, portfolios that are interested in growth, not just stripping and burning companies. I'm going to shoot for software, and I want it to be in this part of the market. So from this revenue to this revenue, and that's all I targeted. And I did lots of networking, and it just so happened the first client I was working with from a consulting standpoint was Bazaarvoice, and they liked me, and I really liked them. I think the leadership of Bazaarvoice is fantastic. Nobody's perfect, but like the team that is there is trying to correct everything they possibly can and do the right thing. And I think it's a really cool business. So for me, it was a way to like really leverage all of the things that I knew and knew really well from a client perspective, from if you look at it from the Bazaarvoice side, but then understand actually how these companies address personas like me and the personas that worked for me. And so I got to learn that, the sales cycle and the different of the product innovation cycles, and the go-to-market differences, and all of that. And that's been just a blast. And it has filled in a lot of knowledge gaps. And I've got a couple of advisors that I do too, but those are carefully chosen to fill in gaps in my knowledge as well.
You have this idea of advising the clients that you and some of the partners that you work with. How does that work? Because you often think about, I've got a client, I've got these deliverables, but this role of being more consultative and being an advisor, talk us through like what's an example of that?
Well, I think from the Bazaarvoice side, a lot of times, well, my remit is really, how do we build relationships at a higher level? The company's growing; it has many, many more products besides what we're really known for, which is ratings and reviews. And part of what our goal is to expose leadership at our clients to what we're really doing in the broader content space, whether it's creator, influencer, shopper, or consumer. We have products that address all of those things in the content space, and not just reviews, but visual and video and text. But we really, hadn't been really successful in beyond kind of our core personas, which are mostly the tactical subject matter experts. So my superpower is that I have been these people, And I go and I can talk to them, and I can talk to them about, like, here's the macro environment in your category, here's the digital environment in macro, and then I can break it down into pieces and then say, here's what you're looking for, and the MarTech stack, or what you're probably trying to do. And of course, I ask questions. I don't presume or assume. And then I break down like where we play, and that in turn opens up more fruitful conversations that helps them understand how important we are, but also can be through the lens of different use cases. And it's also, in a lot of cases, it's eye opening because they can do most of what I talk about with the investments that they've already made. So it's like wringing more and more ROI out of a single asset. And that's kind of the way we approach it from a client perspective. And then I mean, I've done everything you could do. I've at least done it once, and or probably twice, and I've failed at least once out of the two times I've tried it. Right. So I also advise.
You got some experience.
Yeah, so I also advise a lot of time, like, hey, tell me where you are in the process, and some of them are well advanced. So there's some
Right.
categories that are very advanced. Some of them are not, and I just say, well, tell me how you're organized and where your pain points are, and then sometimes I can help kind of coach people through. Um, like, you might want to avoid this, you might want to try this, be careful of this, make sure you align this. And then in a lot of cases too, I'm like, if you're doing any leadership presentations or board presentations, I'm like, been through that, can tell you what works and what
What to
doesn't work.
do and right,
Yeah.
exactly.
So if the client's open, it's more of a consultation. But I do a lot of that, and that's in service, obviously, of Bazaar Voice's broader goals. But it's kind of how I can give back a little bit and build credibility that we know what we're talking about on a broader level, and become better partners overall. And then, therefore, because of being a partner, stickier. It's better for our business overall and theirs.
And it's so great. Well, speaking of content, you coined this term, the content supply chain, which I've been waiting to ask you more about, and it's how we originally met through our
Yeah.
mutual friend Brian Gildenberg. So tell us about the content supply chain. What is it, and how should brands and retailers be thinking about it?
Yeah. It's really interesting. One of the things, and this is one of the things that gets coached, a lot to both our teams, but also to our clients. I'm like, you really need to simplify your talk tracks, because if you're talking to your leadership, they're all brilliant people, but they also have 5,000 things going on, and they're seeing 5,000 presentations. And most times they're just looking for an interpretation of what they're seeing. So if you can help interpret things in a way that makes the conversation go faster, but also ups the understandability of what you're talking about, you really can then spend time on the most important things, as opposed to, for example, explaining technology. And that's the kind of the sticky wicket that we would run into, is explaining, like, well, here's the technology, and like, actually nobody cares about the technology. That was something that we've been training. I mean, like, they don't really care about how it works. They care that it works and that it's effective.
And show me the results.
Yeah, and show me the results. And then, like, if there's a high concept that we're trying to introduce, you like boil it down to something really simple. So this came to light in that I was actually showing Keith Nealon, our CEO. This is very early on when I was actually consulting, and I showed them, him and some of his leadership team, our Martech stack from Hershey, a generic version of it. And I said, and I had little Bazaar Voice logos next to the areas where I thought, or where my teams were actually using different aspects of Bazaar Voice. And it was beyond just ratings and reviews. And then I outlined within that, I'm like, okay, so here's where you're playing, but here are the other spaces where you're not playing. But in my mind, your point solutions and these other point solutions make up my content ecosystem. And it was like, if you can fill in just a few of those other boxes, I said, as a chief digital officer, I will buy more from you, because you're simplifying my life. And that ultimately, like, okay, well, that in itself was still wonky. Now, he's a software guy, so he got all the wonk, and his leadership team got all the wonk. But what I did is I broke it down into basically constituent parts. I said, okay, on the demand side, there's a huge demand of content from consumers, and that demand for content is being accessed through all these different channels. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to push into those channels the content that people want. And on the supply side, that means you have to create a lot more content because there's a lot more channels than there used to be even 10 years ago. And it varies and the formats vary. And there's a lot of data management going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you think about that? And so there's the demand side, which is the channels that are going to get filled with content. But beyond that, it's really like a regular supply chain system where it's like what's the forecast for the content? So what types of content go where? Then you have to basically create it or manufacture the content. Then you have to manage it in some way, shape, or form. Then you have to distribute it into those channels. So it was really just those five boxes. So forecast, manufacture, manage, and distribute, and then consume on the demand side. And then the next click down is say here are all the parts and pieces that make up that content supply chain. And so people like really get that because you talk about five boxes and you're like, here's the demand side, here's the supply side. The supply side is just like you guys manage your businesses on a day to day, Mr. Brand Director or Mr. Brand Manager. And they nod and they're like, yep, totally get it. I'm like, great. Next slide. Here's the same thing, but just talking about content.
So I got to ask, when's the book coming out?
So I didn't know this. I've been joking for like 6 months. I'm like, I should have trademarked that term. As it turns out, my legal team looked into trademarking. They said it's too generic, so we can't trademark it. And I was like, darn it. But I don't know. I would have to think about something like that. I definitely think it's gotten so much traction. Whenever I talk about it, people are like, well, that makes total sense. And it only took me 10 years to come up with it, but
To your point, it takes the what's that joke about Picasso, and he draws the painting, and well, it's a guy, you only took you 60 seconds to draw the painting, but it took me a lifetime to learn how to do it. So yeah.
to learn how to do it. Yeah. Well, I had a lot of people that kind of helped me along the way, and in particular, people like Ollie Bradley and Bob Bowman, Andrea Steele, all who were my teammates at Unilever and also at Hershey. They were the ones that kind of crafted a lot of the thinking. I was just the guy that like stuck it all together and gave it a name. Yeah.
I love it. Well, on that idea of the supply chain and the ecosystem, I'm incredibly excited about our partnership with you and with Bazaarvoice.
Yeah, we are too.
We've got UGC. We're taking that, as you mentioned, a much broader definition of what that is now, and dropping that into images and videos and
Yeah.
display ads for retail media. Tell us a little about, from your point of view, how does that help the customer? What are you seeing? Where are some of the needs?
Well, I think, for a long time, if you go, let's say you go back 10 years ago, or like, oh, personalized ads, and personalized ads was just really hyper targeting. There was nothing personalized about it beyond you're just refining who you were going to target. That was a big realization for me, is from coming more from the digital marketing end. I thought personalization meant really personalizing. And then as I got to really understand what we were doing in media, I'm like, oh, it's not really, you're really just hyper targeting. So things have evolved over time. People are more aligned as to what personalization really means, which is, can you, to the best of your ability, give a bespoke experience to a consumer, regardless of what channel they're consuming content in, right? It could be a product description page, but it could also be an email, it could be a landing page, it could be an ad. And, to do that in a perfect world, it shouldn't be that hard to do. I mean, the technology obviously exists to do all those things, albeit it takes many parts of technology to enable it, and they're not always connected. And then there's one fundamental piece that typically is missing, which is the data hygiene and the data management. So if you're not tagging your assets appropriately, you can't do headless content or personalization at scale because there's no way to make sense of all the different content. It's content. So it's really the magic between content that's connected to either individuals or lookalikes with really, really good metadata and contextual signals that allow you to actually put things together dynamically that's interesting. And we're just getting to the point now where people can start to do it, which is why you need a content supply chain. You need to put a lot of effort in serving that platform as someone who's going to be an advertiser, so that you can deliver those experiences through whatever publisher you're using on the other end. But the ability to do that is really based on the fact: are you managing and tagging content appropriately. You guys have we've got a lot of the, like, I would say, really good metadata. We've got the part of the content ecosystem which is non-branded.
Hmm.
It's all connected up to individual products. So we've got, people, product, and tons of content, and then you've got an ability to put those things together and combine it with branded content. So I think those are the things that initially, when we had a conversation, Dave was like, "Well, that could be really interesting," and I do believe that's where things ultimately will go. Though I think it's going to be more contextualization in the future than pure personalization. A, it works better, and B, it's less complicated. Well, it's still super complicated, but in some ways it's less complicated.
It's doable.
It's doable, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So for us on our center, like, oh, okay, so here's a partner who's got branded content, but can handle user generated content of all forms, has the ability to ingest and do interesting things with it. That's where we think things are going. Great partner.
yeah. That's so great. We're, as I mentioned, super excited about it. You touched on this idea of the advertiser, and that is becoming part of this thought process. But we often historically have talked about retailers and brands, and this idea of advertising being part of things, retail media. Would you spend a minute and just kind of talk about where are things now with retail media? You're talking to so many different brands and retailers. What are you hearing, and what should we be thinking about there?
Well, I think I mean, it's super interesting. It's kind of one of those things in hindsight. It was kind of like, of course, this is going to happen. I was lucky enough that because I was in digital commerce and the big focus, 12 years ago was on Amazon because it was the only, real retailer that was doing a lot of it. They had retail media, and Unilever worked very, very closely with them. My media team at Unilever worked very, very closely with them to help them think through that as a product. And so it's really evolved and whatnot. And I think the way I think about it is, naturally, if you can highly target messages to consumers in a way that's, mid or lower funnel, that's fantastic. And then if you've got some sort of kind of closed loop, that's fantastic. I don't think that's 100% like it's been talked about a lot, but it's still giving away data like that is like, it's one of those things where it's gotten better.
Could improve the performance, but it's
Yeah,
still
exactly.
data that's hard to come by.
So at any rate, for me, it's kind of a no brainer that this was going to happen. But I think the difference between the way I think about it, and it's interesting, Brian Gildenberg actually he gave it different terminology than I would have, you know, given his experience and looking at total retail. But for me, it was retail media network. I think comes in two flavors. There's retail media networks that are attached to retailers that truly have national scaled national reach, and then there's retail media things that are called retail media networks where it's more regional, or the audiences and the reach are sub. I wouldn't say they're subscale, but they're a lot smaller than something you could compare to, say, a Google or a Facebook. Some retailers have that kind of scale. Most retailers do not. And so, in my mind,
And that would be something like a regional grocer or
right.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, or
Okay.
just someone who just doesn't have a lot of traffic in the digital space, even
Yeah,
though they might
yeah,
have a
okay.
national footprint, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah, but they just couldn't have huge e-commerce businesses. And I think that's important because, retailers, of course, are like, well, we want alternate sources of income, particularly if they have a lot of e-commerce, because it's an offset to a lot of the costs there at a macro level, and that makes total sense. And they talk about, I want to access those budget pools. That also makes sense, but only if you really, in my mind, have national scaled reach. Else, you're still more like a shopper marketing, which is still
Important, valuable.
super important, right? But I think that's the thing that most people are struggling with is the retailers want more and more budget, but only certain retailers, I think, in my mind, have products that are mature enough, that perform well enough, or have the reach and scale where it's not a no brainer. You still have to do the analysis, and you still need to put your money where you're getting the most return. But they've at least got, I think, a more cohesive story. I'm not discounting, by the way, any of the retailers that don't have
For sure.
that kind of scale and reach. It's just it's a different thing, and they're going to have to work different muscles, I think, to continue to attract the investment from brands.
Well, when we started off our conversation here, one of the items you mentioned, of course, was AI. We're hearing a lot about that. You're talking with these customers. What are you hearing? They're working on the fundamentals, but also looking ahead to the next couple of years, the next few years. What are some of those things you're exploring and keeping an eye on?
Well, the interesting thing is GPT in my mind just became a poster child for what was already happening. So a lot of the things that I hear brands and retailers talking about in terms of the use of AI as it relates to content is no different than things that I've worked on with my teams for about 10 years. Is like, how do you take, and ratings and reviews is a really good example. Like, how do you take the textual content that you get from ratings and reviews and the sentiment that comes out of that to understand how people are actually talking about your products and your brands and then the categories at a macro level, and then how do you use that information in some way to refine and optimize a product description or the product names or your bullet points or whatnot. So those types of things and that kind of work at a lot of companies that were kind of on the forefront of digital has already been happening. Now it seems everybody wants to do something like that. So it's not it's kind of that idea is more mainstreamed, which is great. Like I think that's great. But with that comes with it some risks and responsibility, and it's really interesting how things repeat, Dave. So AI was not something that could be used to generate tons of content. It was an idea, say 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
But the same thing was happening as people were standing up e-commerce. There was this huge demand for content, like any type of product related content. The retailers would pull it from anywhere and they would put it online, whether it was accurate or not. It was causing all sorts of legal headaches. And so in the early days of e-commerce 12 years ago, at least from a CPG perspective, it was, talking with the legal teams and saying, hey, we need to speed up the way we approve for content, particularly product related content, because all this nonsense is going up there. And they're like, we can't do it that fast. And we're like, we're going to have to put together a process which allows a certain amount of risk so that we can scale this really, really fast. Else, there's more risk in what the market is doing to fill in the content. And the interesting thing about what's happened over the last 6 months is everybody, the first thing they said is like, let's have AI pull content from all over the place and we'll start filling in our content gaps. The issue with that is that it's trained on a lot of data, but not all that data could be the most recent data. And as anybody that's played with ChatGPT knows, it's not really super accurate unless you get really specific about the query itself. So what brands and a lot of people are running into is like, oh, we act and retailers too is like we can't actually fill the content gap just by automating the entire thing and hoping that it picks up the right content. There still needs to be oversight and both from a brand perspective, but also from a retail perspective and most specifically a legal perspective. And until you can figure out all those things and also then apply the technology, it's not that we're not going to be able to scale. It's just like there's just a lot of things other than just press the button and automatically you've solved these huge problems. So lots of great hype and clearly on the analytics and insights component, there's all sorts of things that we're already doing, and from review coaches to the push button analytics on sentiment that are really really super cool. Those are a lot easier, but actually supplanting your content ecosystem, that still needs a lot of work.
Well, before we wrap up here, I did want to spend one more minute. I was wondering, so we've got AI, we've got these various workflows, and we've got this broader idea of retail media at the top of the funnel and UGC. Paint us some brush strokes, broad brush strokes. UGC, what is it for people? How broad is it when we're thinking about how we could use that to keep the content fresh and connect with the shopper?
Yeah, it's a really a big question, but I think, and I think actually user generated content, we have internal conversations around, is that like the term we still need to use, but it's the one that everybody understands. But it's a pretty broad concept. So and even within our own roadmap, we're talking more about like, well, what about the creator communities as opposed to the influencer communities and then the micro influencers and then like, is there a difference between shopper generated content and consumer or user generated content? So UGC is kind of like it's kind of a catch-all in our eyes for that. It's probably at this point an inappropriate descriptor for what's happening in the content world outside the branded content world. But the one thing that is really clear is that you can only afford to do so much branded content, and branded content is super important foundationally. It's the bedrock of your brand. It kind of establishes the brand's proposition and its fundamentals. But because of what we were talking about before, the demand for content through all the other channels, it's so high you cannot spend enough money to actually fill it if you're going to do it the old-fashioned way and like do brand generated, agency created creative. And so for us, it's like that demand is continuing to go up, and it's migrated as the maturity of digital, or as the evolution of digital has taken place. So it's moving more towards visual first, and that's already well established, but not every brand or every retailer is all the way there, even on visual. And then obviously video. I saw something from eMarketer or Insider Intelligence today that was just talking about the consumption of content and in the video realm is extraordinary. We're used to it now, and you can see it by age. Like the younger you get, the more they consume, and it's less about reading and it's more about watching. So we play in those places to a degree now. We will certainly be playing in those places in the future, and I think the ability to very efficiently, from a spend perspective, but meaningfully engage with consumers through the kind of content that they already consume is super important. And so, how do you get that balance between your paid, your earned, your owned, and your social? I think that's something that the companies at the very, very front of the digital marketing pack are starting to really figure out. But that's only like maybe 3 to 5% of the total brands that I talk to. But that's where everything's going to go over time.
100%. And we're seeing that too with let me make the quick video, let me drop it into the image, all the bite-sized content that's really visual.
Yeah, you guys are in a really interesting space, I think, to take advantage of that. I think as long as someone can give you the raw material,
Then we can do a lot with it.
then you're in good shape. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, you've got a great customer tour coming up. Like you, I love talking to customers and helping them hopefully solve some business problems. Tell us about this Inspire tour, and it's in multiple cities, I understand. Sounds really cool.
Yeah. Um, Chicago and New York are the ones that I'm directly involved in. There's also London. I think there might be one or two other locations that I off the top of my head can't remember right now, but it's in most of the major markets. For us, it's not so different from some of the things that we just talked about. So it'll really be a client-led series of conversations where we talk about best practices and use cases, particular novel use cases with those clients. So my job there is not to talk about myself and what I've done in the past, but to talk about like what are they doing right now. And that serves as exactly what it sounds like. It's inspiration for our other clients. Um, and I think that there will be more emphasis on the use of the data that we collect along with the content, different use cases there, certainly around video and visual and how much more important that's going to be. And of course, we'll talk about AI, both things that we're already doing and things that we're planning on doing in the near future. It should be cool.
I love it. I love it. Those are always such great events. Well, let me ask you a couple of fun questions here as we wrap up. First off, folks in your career in your life that have inspired you from a professional perspective.
It's funny. I don't really feel like I really had a mentor actually until my 40s for whatever reason. It's not that I didn't work with good people and that I didn't learn from them, but I think it took a long time before I found somebody I was like, oh wow, um, that person's pretty interesting. And I love their approach to how they do business and the way they think and the way they manage people, and they kind of like have the whole package going on. So if I was named two people in business, it would be Kathy O'Brien, who is my direct supervisor for a few years at Unilever. She was really amazing. She was a very humble person. She was whip smart, she didn't seem to have any securities, or she would joke none that you can see anyway. Um, but she was really comfortable in her own skin. She was a very good general manager. The people that worked with her worshipped her because she could deliver the most scathing critique that, if you parsed it, was like, wow, she's really going after me. But like, she would deliver this in a way where, like, you'd leave the room and you're like, okay, I'll fix that for you, Kathy, and you felt great walking out of the room. I don't know how she did it, but I was like, it's like she told me what needed to happen and what I needed to improve, but she didn't make me feel horrible about it. And I just and sh
Exactly.
yeah, and she took a big risk on me because I was a big unknown. And then the second person in the same vein, connected to Kathy to a certain degree, was a gentleman named Keith Higgins, who ended up being the chief customer officer at Unilever. And he felt like an outsider, like I felt like an outsider. So he came in from P&G to Unilever, and he used to joke that he and I were mud bloods. He had to explain that to me because I wasn't a Harry Potter fan. And he's like, "Look, we're always going to be different, and our job is to continue to maintain to be different because that's what the company needs." And he was another person who was just really brilliant with people, and he had a really tough job, and he always made it seem easy. But again, another person who was really comfortable in their skin, had some amazing ideas, was always motivating, always positive. So those are the two people I think are the most influential in business anyway.
So wonderful.
Yeah. My personal hero, though, is Miles Davis.
Miles Davis. I love it. I love it. And you've got some hobbies, I imagine, outside of work when you find the time. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so I'm an avid guitarist, and I'm currently finishing my second build. The first one was not so successful. The second one's going to be perfect if it kills me. But I'm reproducing Brian May's guitar, the guitarist of Queen. So I contacted his luthier, got the guitar plans, and I'm building an exact replica of his guitar in my basement.
Incredible. So when you find the time, this is your other calling.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but I'm determined to get one working guitar out of this project. One that looks good and plays good. I've got one that plays good, but it it doesn't look so hot.
I love it. I love it. So perhaps if we're lucky, we could do the book tour and at the next Inspire event have some guitar solos.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, Doug, thank you so much for folks that want to get in touch with you digitally online. What's the best way for them to find you?
LinkedIn, I'm fairly responsive.
Thanks again, Doug. It's been a real pleasure.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard, please visit our website at itsrapid.ai, where you can find out more about how we're helping leading brands like PepsiCo save thousands of hours a year when it comes to retail media and digital shelf content creation. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more great episodes of Beyond the Shelf. See you next time.